January 1945, Brussels. A gray file sits under a tungsten lamp, edges frayed, paper swollen from damp winter air, top sheet, file number 333B, rubber-stamped secret in a red that has bled through to the second page. You hear the room before you see it. A desk fan ticks. A typewriter carriage returns with a tired bell. Somewhere behind the door, boots cross a waxed floor and keep going. Fingers, nicotine-stained, lift the cover. A paperclip squeals. Pages breathe apart. Line by line, the document refuses drama. It lists dates, grid coordinates, units, weather, the way the Army likes its truth. Squared, numbered, filed. A thumb pauses at a sentence that does not fit its calm. Cause of death, multiple lacerations before death. Not after, before. The page smells of iodine and dust. Along the margin, a clerk once tested his pen. 3 hesitant dots, then a line. On the back, a faint carbon impression. 11 unidentified Negro troops. A second copy in the folder no longer contains that line. 2 pages, same day. Different truths. The lamp hums. The desk fan clicks again, like a metronome for denial. The man reading is Captain John Rubinstein. He does not clear his throat. He does not look up. He holds the paper with both hands as if the words might slide off unless gripped. Outside, the war is loud. Inside, history will choose a whisper. He flips to a photograph envelope. Evidence, do not release. Inside, prints that have never seen daylight. On the back of one, a clerk has written in pencil, Field east of Wereth, January 1945. He does not show us the image. He reads instead, because paper, not pictures, is how institutions remember without feeling. All 11 identified by tags and effects, condition consistent with prolonged assault, recommend referral to judge advocate. Recommend. Another sheet, onion skin, thin as a conscience, a routing slip, to JAG, from G2, Wereth incident. Someone has underlined incident twice, as if shrinking the word could shrink the weight. He turns back to the first page. A crease runs through the word secret like a healed scar. Listen to the room. A clerk coughs in the corridor. The typewriter bell dings. The fan ticks. The lamp hums. And in the middle of that small, ordinary noise, a fact opens like a trapdoor. They were tortured by Nazis and erased by Allies. The file is not a story yet. It is a posture. It keeps its nouns clean and its verbs obedient. It lists who, when, where. It spares you why. Another page, heavier stock with holes punched too close to the edge so the ledger tore when someone was in a hurry. Across the top, date and hour, 17th December 1944, 1620. Below, the sparse grammar of war, captured by SS patrol. On a later copy, the same line has been kissed by a black bar, then neatly retyped without the sentence at all. It shouldn't exist. But it does. Captain Rubinstein rests the file flat and lays his palm on it, as if calming a horse. Not reverence. Friction. He is measuring the drag between evidence and intention. He reads the last paragraph aloud, because sometimes the only way to carry weight is to give it a voice. Victims belong to 333rd Field Artillery Battalion. Recommend notification of next of kin with standard language, killed in action. Standard language, the 2 safest words in a dangerous universe. On the desk blotter, a square of sunlight moves and stalls. The fan ticks, the lamp hums. He takes a pencil and prints the names in a small, deliberate hand along the margin where no names were meant to go. 1, 2, 3. He keeps going until there are 11, each name separated by a breath he will not admit is grief. He closes the photo envelope. He slides the papers back into order, left edges squared, corners aligned, the choreography of control. Then he does what trained men do when a truth refuses to fit the form. He reaches for the rubber stamp. Case closed. The ink thuds the page. A rectangle blooms. Authority wins the argument for now, but even ink ages, even stamps blur, and some rectangles become windows if you wait long enough. The camera holds on the cover, file number 333B. The room recedes into its noises. What remains is the taste of metal and a single sentence that sticks to the teeth. The paper says, case closed. But someone made sure it never opened. Hold on that line. Because this isn't a story about how men died. It's a story about how their country decided not to look, and how one folder, in one quiet room, still leaks the truth through its edges. 2 copies should mean certainty. In this room, it means doubt. On the left, a field report typed on onion skin, dated 17th of December 1944, time-stamped 1620, routed through G2. On the right, a cleaner duplicate, same date, same routing, different temperature. They line up perfectly until the sentence that matters. Left copy, 11 men of 333rd FABN captured by SS patrol near Wereth. Right copy, a soft rectangular pallor where that line should be. Then the next sentence, politely pretending nothing is missing. The stapled corner creaks when Rubinstein eases them apart. 2 pages, one truth with a fingerprint on it. He turns the onion skin toward the lamp. Ghost letters bloom in the light, the way pressure inks a second life into thin paper. You can read the ghosts even where a ribbon ran dry. Captured by SS patrol. There it is again, stubborn as a bruise. Beside the routing slip, a carbon memo that never left the building. Rephrased to standard KIAs, avoid POW language until confirmation. Initials illegible. The kind of handwriting that trusts secrecy more than spelling. Rubinstein doesn't swear. He aligns the holes over the brass fastener and folds them back down. The discipline looks like calm. It is not. On a separate log, a clerk's ledger of notifications, the phrase next of kin repeats like a lullaby for the living. To the right of 3 names, the same checkmark written twice, as if the hand that made it could not quite believe itself. He draws a breath and opens a second folder. Belgian police notes from St. Vith. A farmhouse name appears 3 times, each spelling slightly different, the way foreign names break against English reports. Langer, Langner, Langanger, the witness, a farmer, the place, a door, the detail that should anchor the story, floats. He flips to a map overlay. Wereth is a small dot off a minor road, the sort of place wars pass through without learning the name. Grid squares, pencil circles, an arrow that changes direction between drafts, the cartography of confusion. Why does any of this matter? Because records don't just record, they choose. They don't only say what happened, they establish what will be permitted to have happened. Rubinstein reads the duplicate again, slower, as if pacing might make the paper honest. In the clean version, verbs are cautious, patience passive, bodies recovered. Effects inventoried. Disposition recommended. Recovered from where? By whom? After what? Questions that a single removed sentence could have answered are now distributed across a bureaucracy like pain across a body. Everywhere and nowhere. He checks the numbering at the bottom right, P2 of 3, but there are only 2 pages in the set. Someone married certainty to arithmetic and left. He writes in pencil, along the margin of his notes, 2 reports, same day, different outcomes. Below it, a second line, fainter, for his eyes only. One says, all accounted for. The other deletes the line completely. The fan ticks, the lamp hums, paper becomes weather. He reaches for the Belgian notes again. The farmer said they were cold. He said one of the men smiled anyway. He said the men asked for water. He said he warned them the Germans were everywhere. He said he heard boots on the road. 5 sentences. The kind of details memory saves when it has no idea it will be needed later. Back to the American folder. A blue pencil slash across a paragraph that tries to be precise and fails. At approximately 1700 HRs, contact lost with service section, Battery C. Attempts to re-establish comms unsuccessful owing to enemy activity and weather conditions. Contact lost. A phrase that covers all sins. Rubinstein lays the 2 versions side by side one more time, not to read them, but to feel the seam where they refuse to touch. The Army has a word for this kind of seam, anomaly. Investigators have another, tell. He closes the left-hand copy, then the right. Stacked together, they sit flush. To the eye, a perfect match. To the hand, the right stack is 2 grams lighter. 1 sentence lighter, 1 admission lighter, 1 future prosecution lighter. He writes a line for the cover memo he knows he will have to draft. Anomaly present in duplicate reporting. Probable language mitigation prior to external routing. Language mitigation, the most courteous way to say erasure. He looks at the photo envelope again and does not open it. If he opens it now, the images will decide the story, and he needs the paper to betray itself first. It shouldn't exist, he says quietly to the room that will never quote him. But it does. He stamps the Belgian map with today's date. He underlines Wereth once, not for emphasis but for orientation, so we don't get lost in paper the way those men got lost in snow. And then he writes the sentence that turns files into a film. That's where this story begins. December 1944, the Ardennes forest, a stretch of pine and frost the Allies had begun calling the quiet sector. Nothing quiet about it now. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion was supposed to be safe here, far behind the front, protecting infantry divisions from miles away with their 155mm howitzers. They were a black combat unit, one of the few allowed to fight in Europe. Most black soldiers had been sent to supply lines or labor detachments. The 333rd had trained to shoot, not to serve. They arrived from England 2 months earlier, men from Detroit, Mississippi, Alabama, New York, Texas. Their commander wrote home, "Morale high, efficiency excellent, we'll prove ourselves here." They believed it. They dug their guns into the frozen ground near a small Belgian village called Schoenberg. White artillery units surrounded them on both sides, better equipped, better supplied. Officially, they were all one army. Unofficially, they were separated by color, even on the radio. Inside their trucks, the radio crystals carried a single code band, a frequency authorized for colored units. If headquarters went silent, they couldn't switch channels. They couldn't even hear evacuation orders. The order to withdraw on December 16th never reached them. At dawn, the horizon began to flicker. German artillery, hundreds of guns, opened the Battle of the Bulge. The sky was a constant flash, white over white. The 333rd responded, firing shell after shell until the snow behind their guns turned black. They held for 24 hours without air cover, without sleep. By the time the next day came, their B and C batteries were almost surrounded. The order finally arrived. Destroy the guns, move west. It was already too late. The men of Battery C service section packed what ammunition they could, then moved through the forest on foot. 11 of them, frostbitten, exhausted, half-starved. They had no maps, only direction. Find American lines. They thought surrendering to any German patrol might mean survival. The Geneva Convention promised as much. They didn't know yet what kind of German unit was sweeping the area. 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had learned to see mercy as weakness. On paper, the American command structure looked orderly. In reality, chaos. Messages lost in snow, supply columns. Cut off. Units misidentified by friendly fire. And among all the noise, 11 black soldiers disappeared without causing alarm. No one radioed for them. No one even knew they were gone. In an after-action report weeks later, a white officer summarized the event in 8 words. Negro section likely overrun. No further contact. That was it. No search party. No names. They should have been found within days. The 333rd's guns were valuable. Their crews even more so. But paperwork moved slower than artillery. Their status shifted quietly from missing to presumed captured. The families back home wouldn't know for months. Telegrams from the War Department arrived with language so polished it barely felt human. We regret to inform you, the circumstances are not yet clear. Your son served honorably. Every family got the same sentence, as if grief could be standardized. Inside the army itself, segregation shaped everything. Barracks, dining halls, even the cemeteries where the fallen were buried. A black soldier could die for the same flag, but not beside a white one. The hypocrisy wasn't lost on anyone. The 333rd knew it. They fought anyway. When the Germans advanced on December 17th, the men of Battery C carried their wounded through knee-high snow, still believing someone would come back for them. When they reached the first Belgian farmhouse, they asked for food, for water, for directions. A farmer named Matthias Langer fed them what little he had and told them to keep moving west. The German patrols were close. They stayed. They had no strength left. Hours later, a column of SS trucks stopped outside the same farmhouse. That is how it should have gone. An American unit follows protocol, goes missing, gets reported, gets rescued. That's how the textbooks would have written it. But that's not what happened. Because the truth about the Wereth 11 isn't just about what the Germans did next, it's about what America didn't. Rubinstein's file will later show it in sterile language. No evacuation attempted due to enemy activity. Behind those 6 words sits a sentence no one typed. They were left behind because of who they were. The official reports from higher command that week talked about tanks, fuel shortages, weather conditions. They never mentioned 11 names. They never mentioned that a segregated frequency, an outdated code, and an indifferent hierarchy had combined to seal a death sentence. It's easy to blame fog. It's harder to admit fog can be policy. They believed the Ardennes would stay quiet. They believed Germany was finished. They believed a segregated army could still call itself free. They were wrong. They followed every order, but the system didn't follow them back. That's where the records fall silent, and where the human story starts talking. By dawn, the forest sounded hollow, the way cold turns every branch into glass. Their breath came out as steam that drifted and then vanished. 11 men moved between pines that creaked like old doors. Boots sank and lifted, the same motion for hours. No one complained. There was nothing to spend words on. They had left the guns the day before. They had done what soldiers do when the map stops agreeing with the ground. Carry what matters. Burn what you cannot carry. Keep going west. By 9, the wind picked up. Frost clung to eyelashes. Fingers ached through gloves. One of them joked that Alabama never felt like this. No one laughed, but the joke made a small space where fear could breathe without growing. They counted distance in fences and hedgerows and the shapes of barns far off. They counted time in the flare of flares to the north and the distant thud that never stopped. The sky stayed white in a way that felt less like light and more like a refusal. They found a track, then a lane, then the outline of a village that was more suggestion than fact. A church spire, smoke, not much else. They kept to the edges. Somewhere a cow lowed the way animals do when they smell something that does not belong. Near midday they saw the farmhouse, low stone walls, a door painted a color the winter had mostly eaten. A man stepped out, then paused like a question. He said his name was Langer. He held himself the way farmers do, straight-backed from years of lifting what the day demands. He saw their faces and did not ask for proof. He saw their uniforms and did not ask for permission. He opened the door. Inside, the kitchen held heat like a secret. A kettle trembled. The table had a burn mark shaped like a coin. He gave them water first, then bread that cracked when torn. He watched the way their hands shook and pretended not to. One of the soldiers smiled at him, a small, embarrassed smile, as if thanking a stranger for an ordinary kindness and not for the difference between collapsing now and collapsing later. His lips were split. He nodded anyway. He said, "We are Americans." The way he said it made the room feel larger. Langer told them what he knew. There were German patrols on the roads. There were trucks moving east and west like a metronome. There were fields that looked empty and were not. He told them to keep going. He said it softly, the way you tell someone you love a truth they do not want. They rested a few minutes more than they should have. Warmth will do that. Food will do that. The sight of a chair will do that. A man's voice that does not belong to your unit will do that. The body hears safety and starts making plans the world cannot honor. By early afternoon, the light began to thin. Langer stood at the threshold and watched the lane. He did not see them first. He heard them. Engines that were not local. Voices with a cadence he had not heard since a different season. Snow carried sound the way water carries light. The trucks pulled up outside the wall. Men jumped down. Black coats, gray helmets, the practiced efficiency of those who have done this too often to be tempted by hurry. What came off them was not heat. It was purpose. Langer turned back to the men in his kitchen, and in that instant they were not soldiers, and he was not a farmer. They were people who understood the shape of danger. He said, "Go." They stood. The chair legs scraped once, and the sound felt too loud for the size of the room. They stepped outside with their hands visible. The air carried the smell of diesel, and the something metal smell cold gives to everything. The shouting began not as commands, but as opinions. Words for color meant as category, the kind of sound that narrows possibilities before any choice is offered. They were American soldiers under the laws of war. They were black men under a different set of laws entirely. Both things were true at once. Only one would matter. They were searched quickly, without care for the small dignity of letting a man keep what he keeps near his skin. Dog tags went into a pocket that was not theirs anymore. A few letters were taken and looked at the way you look at paper that proves nothing, except that someone once had time to write. They were moved to the field behind the farmhouse. The snow had a crust on it you could step on if your weight was the right kind. Their weight did not cooperate. They broke through. They stumbled. Hands reached to steady hands without words. The line reformed. A sergeant among the Germans spoke with a voice trained to stay flat. His flatness did most of the work. He asked names in a language they understood well enough to answer. Their answers were not the right kind of proof. He asked units. They told him. He already knew. He was not counting information. He was counting men. By mid-afternoon, the village held its breath. Windows let curtains fall an inch and rise an inch as if fabric could be nervous. A dog barked once and then found somewhere else to be. The church bell did not ring. That was either mercy or fear, hard to tell. What happened next must be said without spectacle, not to spare the guilty, to spare the truth from the inflation of storytelling. They were not treated as prisoners. They were not processed. They were not led away toward a camp. Time did not widen. It narrowed. The first blow always surprises a witness more than a victim. The second proves the first was no mistake. After that, numbers take over. Anything can be done once. Anything can be repeated. Anything repeated can become policy. Anything that becomes policy can pretend to be inevitable. There are kinds of pain a camera can capture and kinds it cannot. There are marks a winter will keep and marks it will hide until a thaw. There are silences that arrive because people choose them, and silences that arrive because sound has been removed from a place. This was the second kind, not panic, not confusion, arithmetic. The arithmetic of a field with footprints fanning out and then stopping. The arithmetic of voices that start at a given volume and end at none. The arithmetic of a farmer who stands at his door with his hands at his sides because there is no correct placement for them. By evening, the trucks left the way they came, each movement reversed as if the day were a film spool winding back onto itself. The lane returned to itself. The air returned to the ordinary cold. The only thing that did not return was time. Langer walked into the field when the last engine noise had become memory. He didn't move quickly. There is a speed that belongs to chores, and a speed that belongs to danger, and a third speed that belongs to grief. He used the third. What he saw is not for recounting in a voice that wants you to listen past what is respectful. What matters is what he did. He learned the shape of each place where a person had been and where a person now lay. He looked long enough to memorize without meaning to. He went back to his house and found a blanket, and then another, and then stopped because blankets are for the living. He stood, undecided, and the indecision was a kind of prayer. The snow began to fall again. It did not cover anything. It dressed what had happened in a formal way, as if nature understood that ceremony is owed even when language fails. Night is not kind in the Ardennes in December. It makes rooms smaller and fields larger. It makes lamps seem like invitations and roads seem like arguments. Langer slept or did not, and woke to a morning that had the same face as the one before. By the end of that week, American troops came back through that village. They asked questions in the quick way of men who have been told to move and know that moving is the only order that will be enforced. Langer told them what he could. He took them to the field. The soldiers who followed him were trained for this and not trained for this. They looked. They went still. Then they followed their training again. They measured. They sketched. They numbered. They wrote. They did it with a care that did not exclude disbelief. They sealed photographs in envelopes and then sealed the envelopes inside the part of themselves that handles work without telling the rest of the self what it has done. One officer stood apart and watched his own breath leave and fail to make a difference. He didn't speak. He touched his own sleeve as if confirming allegiance. He took out a notebook and did not open it. He put it back. He looked again at the field as if a second look would ask less of him than the first had asked. It did not. Later, in a different place, in a warmer room, the words would be chosen. The words would be small because small words balance better on paper. The words would say condition. They would say evidence. They would say consistent with. The words would avoid saying what everyone in that field already knew. Back in the kitchen of the farmhouse, Langer wrote a line on a piece of paper that had once held a shopping list. He wrote, 11 Americans. He wrote the date. His hand shook, not from cold, now, but from the awareness that a piece of paper sometimes has to stand in for everything a country should have done. In the weeks that followed, the 333rd fought on under different commanders with fewer men than they had trained with. The war pressed forward. The maps in headquarters grew new arrows as if strategy were mostly a matter of art. The names of the 11 did not appear in those briefings. The names lived somewhere else, where names wait when they are not yet allowed to become public. Families back home kept waiting for letters. Mail takes its time in a war. Hope takes longer. A mother in Detroit put a pot on the stove at the same hour she always had, because time is the last routine to surrender. A father in Mississippi folded the same newspaper twice, as if he might find a different headline beneath the first. A sister in Tennessee wrote 2 pages about nothing important and added a line at the end that a censor would pass and a brother would read and then tuck into a pocket near his heart. The letter did not arrive. The pocket stayed empty. The heart kept its own counsel. The field did not keep secrets well. Snow is not a vault. It changes shape when the wind asks it to. It grows a crust that breaks under feet. It lifts at the edges and slides. It reveals and then tries to apologize by covering again. Langer went back each day with a resolve that had no audience and therefore counted more. He stood. He cleared away what the night had done. He spoke the word Americans aloud once and heard how it sounded when a Belgian mouth carried it. He said their number. He didn't try the names. The names were not his to borrow. By late January, American units held the ground with a confidence that had cost them too much. The investigation began the way official grief always begins, with measurements and questions and coffee that goes cold because someone forgot to drink it. There were men who did their jobs well and men who did their jobs quickly, and sometimes they were the same men. The file thickened. The answers did not. What happened in that field was not a battle. It was not an accident. It was not the heat of combat or the fog of war or any phrase that lets a person look away without admitting to it. It was a decision, not one decision, but many, made at speeds both sudden and slow, by men in coats and men in offices, by those who gave orders and those who obeyed them, and those who learned to live inside a system that could carry 2 truths at once and use the easier one. There is a sentence that tries to carry too much weight and still ought to be said. They stayed human. Through pain that had no interest in their humanity, they kept it. In the way one steadied another when the ground betrayed him. In the way someone smiled at a farmer because gratitude was still possible. In the way no one broke ranks by blaming fate aloud. In the way silence was used not to hide, but to hold. There is another sentence that is heavier and has to be said. Anyway, they were not allowed to remain alive. By nightfall, the day took back everything it had offered. The cold returned to its work. The village returned to its fear. The field returned to its shape. The record, when it came, chose words tidy enough to file. Across that tidy line, the truth keeps walking. They surrendered to survive. They did not. Brussels, January 1945. The war outside has turned from thunder to a low mechanical pulse, the sound of trucks moving victory from one map to another. Inside a temporary office near the train yards, the lights stay on all night. Captain John Rubenstein sits across from a stack of papers that refuse to behave like evidence. The smell of carbon ink and ration coffee fill the air. Each page describes an act of horror, but the paragraphs are careful, the sentences obedient. He reads the same line for the 5th time. Condition consistent with prolonged assault. He places the page down, then looks at the photograph attached to it. The photo is grainy, black and white, a smear of snow and shadow. The human shape inside the frame is reduced to outlines. The camera's distance makes it easier to look at and harder to understand. A lieutenant enters carrying another envelope. He looks too young to have learned what silence can cost. They found more witnesses, he says. Locals near Malmedy. It's the same division. Rubenstein nods. Leibstandarte. "Sir, should we send this file to London?" He doesn't answer. Instead, he pulls a cigarette from the box, lights it, and studies the flame as if the answer might rise with the smoke. The younger officer waits, then says quietly, "Sir, these men were colored troops?" Rubinstein looks up. "Yes. And command wants to file it as an incident, not a massacre." The word lands like a stone dropped in water. It makes no sound you can measure, but it changes everything beneath the surface. He exhales slowly. "Do you know why they chose that word?" The lieutenant shakes his head. "Because incident doesn't have to be prosecuted." He stamps out the cigarette. The ash spreads like gray frost across the table. He turns to the last page of the investigative report. Someone has written in pencil, "Possible propaganda risk if publicized. Recommend discretion." Propaganda risk. The phrase tastes of paper and cowardice. He closes the folder halfway, leaving the top corner exposed. He looks at the typed list of names, 11 of them, each attached to a number, as if numbers make death neater. "They fought for a country that didn't even let them eat in the same tents," he says quietly. "Now we're deciding if their deaths are worth embarrassment." The young officer shifts uncomfortably. "Sir, it's not our call." That's what everyone says before history calls it theirs. He opens the window an inch. The cold leaks in, bringing the scent of snow and the faint metallic odor of trains in the yard. Far away, a bell rings for a convoy ready to move east. He looks back at the file. "If this leaks, Congress will burn," the lieutenant whispers. "Then maybe it should," Rubinstein replies. For a moment, the room stops breathing. Outside, the war continues in its practiced rhythm. Inside, the idea of truth sits between two men and waits for courage that may not arrive. Rubinstein picks up the report again. He underlines a sentence in red pencil. "No humane inhibitions were observed." He circles it once, twice. He knows no one will ever see it. He knows how quickly red fades on cheap paper. He signs his name at the bottom, not out of pride, but to mark that someone once saw and refused to pretend blindness was duty. When the young officer leaves, the door closes too gently. The silence that follows is not peace. It is the kind of quiet that fills rooms where decisions are being made about which deaths can be remembered. Rubinstein stands, stretches his back, and stares at the map on the wall. A red line shows the Allied front pushing east. Victory looks inevitable. Justice does not. He murmurs, "Nazi racism killed them. American silence buried them." The words hang in the air like smoke that refuses to dissipate. He takes the rubber stamp from the drawer. The label reads, "Case closed." He hesitates. The ink pad has dried at the edges. He presses harder. The stamp lands on the cover with a dull thud. For a second, he considers blotting it out, writing something else. Case denied, case continuing, case not finished. But he doesn't. He slides the folder into the cabinet, fourth drawer from the bottom, next to reports no one reads until wars are old enough to be called history. He locks the drawer. On his way out, he stops by the door and looks back at the cabinet. He says to no one in particular, "They deserved better than paperwork." He turns off the light. The typewriter on the other desk glows faintly in the dark, a single key reflecting moonlight. Somewhere in another office, someone is already drafting the official statement. "We regret to report 11 casualties sustained during enemy action. All acted with honor." No mention of torture, no mention of the SS, no mention of why. That is how a crime becomes a file, and how a file becomes history that never raises its voice. Outside, snow begins to fall again, as if the sky itself is trying to cover what people won't. Inside that locked drawer, under the rubber stamp and the smell of cold smoke, a truth waits, patient, unfinished. The lamp above the empty desk flickers once, then steadies. It is the kind of light that knows secrets. When the snow finally melted in the Ardennes, it revealed more than branches and wreckage. It revealed a silence that had been agreed upon. The 333rd regrouped months later under new command. The survivors never spoke publicly about the men who didn't return. In the paperwork, they were missing in action. In memory, they were ghosts standing in the back row of every company photograph, unacknowledged but present. In early spring, American recovery teams moved through Wereth. They cataloged what was left with the discipline of men taught that neat handwriting equals respect. They made sketches, photographs, lists. They wrote cause of death, enemy action. Then they left. The bodies were taken to a temporary cemetery near Henri-Chapelle. Wooden crosses, painted white, names spelled as best as the clerks could guess. Each cross bore a number. Each number entered a ledger. Each ledger locked in a cabinet. For the families back home, the telegrams arrived through Western Union, identical in typeface and tone. The Secretary of War desires to express his deep regret that your son has been reported missing in action. Weeks later, a second message, now presumed dead. No mention of torture, no explanation. In Detroit, Mrs. Stewart fainted when she read the second telegram. In Mississippi, Mrs. Fort said nothing at all. In Texas, Nathaniel Moss's father stood on his porch and looked east for a long time. He said, he died wearing the same uniform they told him not to wear to town. The war ended. Europe celebrated. America congratulated itself for defeating racism abroad. Segregation at home continued untouched. The file labeled Wereth incident stayed in Brussels until 1947, then was shipped to Washington with other unresolved European cases. In 1951, it was archived at Fort Meade, Maryland, Box 7, Drawer 14. The key was misplaced sometime in the 1960s. By then, nobody was asking for it. Years passed. The 333rd was dissolved. Veterans came home to separate lunch counters, separate schools, separate graves. Some told their children that the Army had taught them discipline. Others never mentioned the Army at all. In Belgium, the farmer Matthias Langer kept returning to the same field. Each spring, he cleared the grass with a scythe. Each winter, he placed a small wooden cross and a handful of wildflowers there. He never called it a memorial. He called it duty. His neighbors told him to forget. He said, "The ground remembers even when men choose not to." When he died, his son took over, then his grandson. The Langer family kept the field alive the way a family keeps a wound clean. Half a century later, that grandson, Herman Langer, was a schoolteacher in St. Vith. He found his grandfather's notebooks while cleaning the attic. Inside, he discovered 11 names written in pencil, and beside them, a sentence. They were Americans, and they trusted me. He went to the Belgian archives. He found the investigation reports, yellow and brittle. He traced the serial numbers, the coordinates, the witness statements. He wrote letters to American Veterans Associations, to the Pentagon, to anyone who might listen. At first, no one did. Then one historian replied. Then a journalist. The story began to move, quietly, the way thawed water moves under ice, before it breaks the surface. In 1994, 50 years after the massacre, a small ceremony was held in Wereth. It rained. 8 people attended. Herman, 2 local officials, a handful of American veterans, and 3 relatives of the dead. They stood in a muddy field and read the names aloud. Each name disappeared into the wind. No cameras, no generals, no speeches about freedom. A reporter from Liège wrote a 3-paragraph story for the local paper. One line read, "Justice delayed can still sound like justice if the world is quiet enough." In 2004, a permanent stone memorial was built beside the road. The plaque lists all 11 names. Travelers sometimes stop, read a few, take a photograph, and continue toward Bastogne. Most don't notice the line at the bottom carved deeper than the rest. Murdered by the SS, forgotten by the Army. Back in the United States, veterans groups began to push for recognition. The Army resisted at first. "The case lacks complete documentation," an officer wrote. But the documentation had been there all along, locked behind misfiled stamps and cautious language. By 2011, a documentary crew filmed Herman standing beside the memorial, his breath visible in the cold. He said, "My grandfather saw what happened. My father carried it. I just refused to let it vanish." 2 years later, in 2013, the U.S. Army finally awarded the Bronze Star and Purple Heart to the Wereth 11. The medals were presented to surviving relatives in a quiet hall in Washington. No television coverage, no apology, only a chaplain's brief prayer. May they rest in peace. The families wept, not from joy, but from exhaustion. A niece of Private George Davis said, "They took his life, then they took his dignity. Now, they give us a certificate. In 2019, 75 years after the snow of Wereth, another memorial rose in Georgia at Fort Benning, now renamed Fort Moore. The granite stands 8 feet tall. At its base lies a bronze plaque that simply reads, 11 soldiers of the 333rd, justice delayed. At the dedication, a military band played softly. Herman Langer, now gray-haired, stood among them. When asked if he was satisfied, he answered, "Satisfied? No. But at least the silence has to share the space now." The cost of those 50 years was measured not only in time, but in faith. Faith lost in institutions, in flags, in promises. It took 75 winners for their country to say their names out loud. The first death was by hate. The second, by history. And both were preventable. For every war crime uncovered, there is another one waiting under bureaucracy. For every monument built, there are dozens of files still stamped classified. The Wereth file was not unique. It was simply unlucky enough to be found. When the ceremony ended, Herman knelt in the grass. He touched the stone the way a man checks a pulse. He said, "The earth still remembers." Then he stood, brushed the mud from his knees, and looked west. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay America, the country those 11 men died believing in, and the country that had needed half a century to admit it. Justice had finally arrived, but it arrived like old light from a dead star, visible, real, and far too late to warm anyone. The people who decide what becomes history do not shout, they file. Years have passed since the stamp hit the folder, since snow took its time returning the field to grass. Papers yellow, photographs silver at the edges. The men who could have admitted the truth learned a habit that felt like professionalism and sounded like caution. They told themselves they were protecting morale. They told themselves they were protecting the war effort. They told themselves a story about timing. But timing is a choice. Silence is, too. Stand on the road at Wereth. It is late afternoon. Wind moves through trees that have learned every version of winter. Cars pass, mostly unaware. A stone waits by the ditch line, bearing 11 lines of text that require no adjectives. The ground is ordinary and not ordinary. If you stand there long enough, the road noise thins and you can hear what the place will say to anyone patient enough to listen. This is where the war ended for men whose country would not end its war with them. Read the plaque. The letters do not raise their voice. They do not need to. They have the advantage of being carved where paper once blinked. Across the ocean, in rooms with flags and microphones, people describe the Second World War as a triumph of freedom. They are not wrong, but they are not finished. Freedom that cannot bear to name its own betrayals is only half grown. In classrooms, the Battle of the Bulge is taught with arrows and tonnage, and the weather report for December 1944. Students learn that German armor outran its gasoline, that American logistics solved problems with trucks and stubbornness. The unit numbers change, the maps change, the test questions change. The field at Wereth does not. For a long time, the families of the dead measured time by 2 calendars, the calendar on the wall with its holidays and graduations, and the hidden calendar that marked each year their sons and brothers remained a rumor the Army would not dignify with a full sentence. A funeral brings a kind of peace. A file does not. What do we owe them now, beyond stone and ceremony? We owe them the truth spoken plainly, not because plain words can reverse a field, but because plain words are the only currency worth anything in a world that turns people into paperwork when it is tired. They were murdered by men trained to see them as less than human. Then they were ignored by a system trained to keep the country from seeing itself. Those are not the same crimes. Together, they make a lesson you cannot outsource to another nation's guilt. There is a line that appears in speeches every November about sacrifice. It is accurate and incomplete. Sacrifice offered is one thing. Sacrifice demanded by indifference is another. The difference is not poetry, it is policy. Imagine the cabinet again, the one with the 4th drawer from the bottom. The lock is cheap, the metal gives a little if you lean. Inside, file backs face outward like spines on a shelf. You can read the titles, village names, dates, cases that could bear prosecution, and cases that could bear delay. Somewhere among them rests the file that taught a generation of officers that decorum can be used as a mask. The paper inside it didn't change when the drawer shut. Only the temperature changed. The day the folder was finally pulled and carried to a table, no miracle occurred. People did the work they could have done earlier. They found witnesses, they found maps, they found their voices. The world did not split open to accommodate the truth. The room simply accepted it. That is the real power of an apology. Not that it changes the past, but that it refuses to keep lying about it. A historian once said that memory is not what you keep, it is what you refuse to discard. The Langer family refused. They gave the world a method for stubbornness. Cut the grass, keep the notes, repeat the names. The rest of us can learn that discipline. There is a temptation to make this story safe by declaring it resolved. The medals were awarded, the memorials stand, the film was made. But resolution is not the same as repair, and repair is not the same as justice. Justice would have been 11 men old in their chairs, telling grandchildren what snow feels like at 30 below. Justice would have been a trial in 1945 that forced the world to look. Justice would have been an army that did not need 50 years to say the obvious aloud. We cannot deliver that now. We can deliver something smaller and still necessary. We can tell the truth without hedging, and we can make room for the kind of grief that prefers quiet to slogans. Say the number. 11. Say the place. Wereth. Say the unit. 333rd Field Artillery Battalion. Say what happened, without the comfort of euphemism. They surrendered to survive. They were tortured. They were executed. Their story was buried because telling it would have embarrassed the living. This is the sentence that took 50 years to write on official paper. Write it on your tongue so it does not wear off for lack of use. In Georgia, at Fort Moore, the granite surface holds a bronze plaque. On some mornings, the light hits it in a way that turns the metal into a mirror. If you stand close, you will find yourself inside the reflection, framed by names you do not deserve to stand beside, and that is the point. Memory is not about deserving, it is about proximity. Put yourself near enough to be implicated. If there is a lesson fit for a country that prides itself on candor, it is this. The courage to defeat an enemy abroad does not absolve the courage required to admit what we hide at home. Nations, like people, are measured less by their victories than by the truths they can say without flinching. They called it classified. I call it silence. They called it an incident. I call it a murder followed by a decision to forget. They called it unfortunate. I call it deliberate. And here is the part that does not end at Wereth. Files can still be closed. Language can still be softened until it erases the shape of the thing it claims to describe. We still decide every day what fits inside the story we tell about ourselves. That choice is not neutral. It is a tool. Used carefully, it repairs. Used carelessly, it wounds. Who then gets to choose whose pain becomes a paragraph and whose becomes a footnote? Who gets to decide which names make it onto the stone and which stay locked in a drawer that nobody opens until the key is a generation old? Who gets to define patriotism so narrowly that telling the truth sounds like disloyalty? If truth can be classified, is justice ever real? Listen to the field. It does not argue. It does not forgive. It holds. Listen to the office. The fan ticks, the lamp hums, the stamp waits. Listen to the quiet voice of a man who wrote 11 names in a margin because the margin was the only space left to write in. You tell me what we owe them now. A plaque, a medal, a chapter in a textbook, or something heavier, a promise that when the next folder lands on a desk and the sentence that matters is the one that embarrasses us, we will choose the sentence anyway. History remembers the flash and the flags. It almost forgot the room where a man whispered that silence would finish what hatred began, because silence is still a weapon.